Today, we are going to talk about self-care.
Hey everyone, welcome to XYZ Storytellers, a platform started by three people across generations X, Y, and Z, engaging in conversations in the spirit of increased empathy and understanding.
Hi, I'm Erin, the millennial traveler and author. I'm an empath with a drive for connecting to others. I enjoy singing in the car, eating pints of ice cream, and hanging out with my cat, Gimbal.
Hey, I'm Rich, the graybeard Gen Xer with 30 years in conference rooms or airplanes around the globe. I've also been a Little League coach and a family bus driver. This podcast is a way for me to have the types of conversations that just don't happen enough in my day-to-day life.
And me, I'm Lily. I've always been very opinionated and I speak passionately about things no matter who I might be with at the time. I'm here to share my thoughts and get the perspectives of two other generations so I can grow and expand my understanding of the world around me.
With XYZ Storytellers, our conversations aren't meant to be political, social, or even related to current events. We are just recording authentic conversations on a variety of topics, hoping they will resonate in some small way. Thanks for listening.
What does it mean to you?
The funny thing is, I haven't heard of the term until recently, the past 2 years. Everyone's been talking about self-care and how important it is. But the way when I first heard it, the way I thought of it was taking care of yourself, showering, eating, drinking water, exercising. I thought that was self-care. But the more that everyone talks about it, I think what it means to me is just taking care of yourself in general, whether it be mentally, physically, or just any other way, taking a day off whenever you need it and just relaxing, or pushing yourself whenever you don't want to. So I think self-care is just taking care of yourself and your goals.
You know, it's interesting. I found an article a couple months ago, actually, when I was scrolling through Facebook. It was one of those articles, but I opened it up because I was kind of curious, and it went into this rant about how we think that self-care is bath bombs and smoothies and treating yourself to Starbucks. But it goes so much deeper than that, like what you were saying. I mean, it's working towards your goals, and it's respecting what's going to get you to the place that you want to be, including self-care for your finances and self-care for your physical health, not necessarily out of appearance or out of pride, but out of health, strictly for health purposes. And it was kind of fascinating because I never thought about my finances as being self-care, when in reality that does play a lot into our stress levels and how we perceive the rest of the world around us. And so it was kind of a different perspective that I hadn't considered, because I too thought that self-care was getting massages in Starbucks and getting bath bombs.
Mm-hmm.
Rich, when's the last time you've used a bath bomb?
I've actually never used a bath bomb.
You're missing out.
Well, that's all right. I've used Epsom salts, but that's because I'm old.
I use Epsom salts all the time.
Yeah, so, healthcare, I think for me as the oldest one on the call, I think it runs a little deeper. I think given where each of you are in your life stage, I think your perspective on self-care is spot on. But I think, though, it takes a more powerful meaning for my generation, if I could actually draw a distinction for one of the few times. When you get to be a parent and you get to be responsible for others, a lot of people tend to get into a trap where they have to do things. It's their job. If nobody else is going to do this, it won't get done. Whether that's, and it's to a standard that was set by the previous generation, by our parents, right? So it's about you've got to keep the house clean a certain way, so you're working, but now you're working full time and you've got to be always working towards that promotion. And then you've got to keep up with the Joneses and have all the cars. And then you've got to be able to send your kids to the most expensive colleges. And so there's all these things that you have to do for others, or to keep up an image in this perception of others. And what was happening, or what happens, is everybody reaches a breaking point. And whether it's a divorce or it's, some sort of they quit the job, or there's an addiction that takes over, then they take on coping mechanisms to be able to give them energy to do different things, and you get out of balance. And so for my generation, I think self-care is about taking that breath and listening to yourself. And if some of it is slowing down at work, or not worrying about the messy house, or going out with friends, or just sitting on the couch and doing nothing on a Saturday when before you'd been doing all these different things. And so self-care is a learned skill for my generation. Thinking about your mental health, because I think mental health challenges have hit a fair amount of my generation. And it's been undertreated. Even getting treatment for mental health problems has been something that we've struggled with, because it's a sign of a weakness or whatever. So self-care, we're in a react mode to the need for self-care in my generation, and probably my parents' generation, whereas your generations are in kind of this, okay, this is a part of becoming a healthy adult. So that's kind of where I kind of look at it from a different perspective, I think.
I think what's both interesting and concerning is how quickly, or how early on, we're thinking about self-care, and how early on we have to. I think self-care for me, a lot of that is just being able to know when to say no and not put additional things on my calendar, because I know that it might be an opportunity that I don't want to pass up, but if it's going to stress me out and take away my ability to go to the gym or take breaks or relax, then it's not going to be good for me in the long run. But then I look at Lily, your generation, and there's all this pressure to get good grades, be at extracurriculars, decide on a college, and decide on a career path. So at such a young age, and go to work. And there's all of these, I feel like there's kind of a trickling down pressure, if you will, of having to have all of this stuff on your plate. And knowing when to say no is one thing, but recognizing opportunity and being able to balance whether or not it's going to benefit you. I don't know, that's kind of a more profound version of self-care, because I feel like it's so easy to take on so much, and that's why self-care is important. But it's also unfortunate that younger and younger generations are having to deal with so much extra stress from life. I don't know how you feel about that, Lily, or if you feel like there is an added pressure or stress than what you'd like.
I think part of it is stress from others and like other generations, like pushing it on us. There's so many articles like talking about like how lazy and we are, and how weird we are, how obsessed we are with the internet. Like I think that's part of the pressure, but I think it's also self-inflicted. Like I'm just speaking for myself and like my friends that I know of, we're very hard on ourselves, and we push ourselves very hard. And I think we're all like almost perfectionists, because when I was little and I was in gymnastics and I would try a new skill and I couldn't get it on my first try, Dad, I think you know what I'm talking about, and I couldn't get it, I would cry and I would just feel so bad about myself, and I would think I'm the worst gymnast in the world. And now I'm looking back and I'm like, how did I think that I was going to get that on the first try? Like I'd never done that before, and I was so hard on myself. So I think it's not all other generations. I think it's mostly us like expecting a lot from ourselves. But then from that, we've also learned, like growing up, or for me personally, I've learned when to keep going, and when I know I can do it, and when I know I'm not going too far, and when I should stop and take a breath and just take a step back. Because from me pushing myself when I was like little and like a child, like I've learned that I can't do everything on the first try, and I can't perfect everything just because I want to. So I think in ways it's helped me learn to pace myself and learn how to take care of myself whenever I'm pushing myself too hard. So I think it has a negative impact growing up. Not negative, but just a harder impact. But then now that I'm like almost done with high school, I think it helped me pace myself.
So you kind of developed a self-regulation, which in turn is self-care, by understanding that you can't put that pressure on yourself to succeed the first time around.
Yeah.
And that is a form of self-care. It's a practice of mindfulness and reflection and kind of processing life in a way that's a little bit healthier of a perspective than when we were younger. So I think there is a certain level of developed self-care that we kind of latch onto as we grow up out of sheer necessity and survival.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I'm going to challenge it a little bit, what you said, Lily, and I'm going to be careful in how I do it because I don't think you're wrong entirely. But I think there's a danger in assuming that your generation is perfectionists and our generations weren't. And I'm not saying you're being accusatory in any way, so bear with me as I go through my thought here. I felt a lot of pressure to do well and to work hard. And there was peer pressure and there was bullying and there was all sorts of different things happening. There was, drinking and drugs when I was growing up. And Aaron, you had it in your school too. And so I think that's part of the age that we all go through. I think I can't fully explain or really kind of quantify how different it is, Lily, that you all have it played out in social media and what pressure or what frequency or constancy that adds, right? Because if in the 70s or 80s, when I was in school, you'd go to school and then you'd go home. And for some of us, being home was a safe haven because unless you picked up the phone, you could completely just cocoon in with your family where you were safe, right? So you could create this alternate world a little bit where it was like, there wasn't any bullying or there wasn't any peer pressure or, you weren't, but we had to try out for sports teams and you didn't make them sometimes, or you had to, try different activities and you didn't get selected for things. I mean, so there's a lot that is similar just in the age group. But I think the blessing and the curse, right? So the internet also allows for your generation, Lily, to understand how prevalent or how damaging bullying can be, even with just the trading of words and stuff. Now, granted, it also is a vehicle by which bullying happens, right? But you can see things where people are now getting called out for bullying, and you've got people who are advocating and coming to the rescue virtually for people who have been bullied. I mean, there was a guy young boy in Australia that was being bullied, and people rallied around him, the celebrities rallied around him and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for the kid. That would never have happened in the 70s or the 80s. But the awareness of someone's being bullied or the coming out and the toll it takes to be able to come out in front of your family or with your family and to find a supportive community somewhere within, right? So I think the landscape has changed, but there's not that much different. But this notion of self-care is new. So I don't know, I was just trying to share a little bit. I wasn't invalidating your points, Lily. I was just trying to add a perspective to it.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I just didn't know what y'all went through when you were growing up. I was just speaking for myself. So I think It's cool that y'all had the similar experiences, but now we're all just now talking about self-care at the same time, even though we've all gone through it growing up. Even though I'm not fully grown up, I know that. What was I gonna say? Oh, the mental health part of it, the one that you were talking about whenever you were talking about your perspective on self-care. I don't know if this is necessarily mental health or if it's just a physical relaxation thing. But when I was little and in elementary school, and me and my siblings would fake being sick, and we would tell our parents oh, I'm sick, I can't go to school. There was sometimes I was really sick and I couldn't go to school, but there was a few times where I was I can't go to school today, I can't do it. And I think my parents knew that, but I think they also knew maybe they need a day off to just relax, because later my mom told me, she was like, I knew you guys were faking it, but if you really wanted to fake it that bad, like there had to be a reason you didn't want to go to school. But yeah, I think that's important, to just let yourself take like one day and just relax, because doing a routine every day, set like 365 days a year, is so tiring, and it's so like straining on yourself. So I think giving yourself a day to relax and just not do anything is good for you, and I think that's a form of self-care.
What's interesting to me is that other cultures have self-care built in so well to their work hours and to their holidays, and I feel like in the States we just have self-care kind of backwards. It's something that you react with rather than plan for, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's this mentality of just do, right? And we're a community of doers, and the idea of just being, right? I mean, I think Aaron, you and I have shared some stuff on that. The idea of just want to be, and that's a beautiful thing, and it's a powerful thing. And there's doing, there's trying, and there's being. And I think you've got to recognize you need to be in each of those states at different times, in those frame of minds. I think the American capitalist mentality of more is always better, right? And if I'm not winning, I'm losing. Second place is the first loser. If you're not growing, you're falling behind. I mean, all these different mantras that are all about push, 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 and invariably you see examples where people just burn out. Some of the best athletes in junior high in the US quit the sport. They've been doing it since they were 6 years old, and now they're in their 10th year of doing it, and they're done. They've got no enthusiasm. And this is someone who, if they had just done it recreationally for the first 12 years or 10 years or 8 years even, and then they came into it and they loved it when they got into high school, and they still loved it when they got opportunity in college, maybe they become a professional athlete just because they had both the love of something and the skill. But I think sometimes our culture, we won't know. You can't prove a negative, right? So I don't know how many superstars are lost, how many scientists, there's people that you see, these kids that are proteges at the violin and different things that they do as children, and they're held up as this amazing thing, and they get all this laser focus on them, and then you see him 15 years later, and he's happy as a truck driver. I was like, do you play the violin? Oh, I haven't picked up a violin in 8 years. Why is that? Well, it's just I got tired of doing it. I was doing it every day, like you said, Lily, 7 days a week, 6 hours a day, whatever. So I think you have those kind of case studies that are exactly examples of, in a narrow part of someone's life, the importance of self-care and that mental. And I knew there were times, Lily, when I would go in and say, well, hey, you got to go to school. And you're like, oh, I don't feel good. You could just tell by the tone, like your mom said, you knew you weren't sick, but you were selling it really hard. And you hardly, it wasn't like we spent every day trying to get you out the door. I mean, more often than not, at a very young age, you were getting yourself out the door and you were getting yourself ready, and you needed almost no prompting. So on those days when it was like, she's not even up out of bed, but that's what it amounts to me, is you've got to look at your whole self. And to your, Aaron, finances, right? There's finances, there's eating, there's exercise, there's socializing, there's family time. But even when you go down that list, it gets overwhelming of,
I know.
I
feel
mean,
like I need self-care from my self-care practice.
Well,
It's just too many options.
Right, but that goes to that trying and being thing, right? I'm just me. And, could my credit rating be better if I was a little more diligent? Yeah, it could be, but I'm not looking to borrow anything in the next couple of years, and I've got the credit cards that I need at a rate that I like. And, you know, it's like the idea of the people getting angry about people in, you know, homeowners association. They're like, blah, 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 you're hurting the value of my house. I'm like, well, are you planning on selling your house? Well, no, I'm going to live here my whole life. Well, then what are you worried about?
Well, and I think that there's a difference between like having it on the self-care list for a matter of achievement versus just managing it responsibly. I am not at all where my finances could be. I mean, I'm self-employed, and that's a huge dent in building a financial future for myself. But in terms of how that fits into the rest of the puzzle of my life, I'm actually doing really well, considering that I am self-employed and that I do have to pay out of pocket for some things and don't have insurance, like dental insurance. Don't worry, guys. I'm still on my parents' medical insurance. If anything happens, I'm covered for the next year, and then I have to figure things out. But, you know, we are interested in getting a house, my boyfriend and I, and we may not be financially there. But right now, when I think about my overall situation, financially, I'm stable. I'm putting food on the table. I have a roof over my head. If something happened to my car, I could fix it tomorrow. It would put a dent in things, but I could do it. And I think that's where it's more just personal responsibility than continuing to strive to be the best in that area. And I know that's not exactly what you were saying, but I wanted people to keep in mind that self-care for other aspects isn't becoming a bodybuilder and getting rich. It's just knowing when you're treating your body with love and knowing when you're treating your finances with love, and at least accepting, okay, I'm here where I'm here right now. And like you said, Rich, just being and accepting that this is where it's going to be right now, but also not spending irresponsibly or eating Big Macs for every meal. There's a balance. And I think that's really what self-care is a balance, and knowing when to say no to taking on extra assignments. Obviously, Lily, you don't have that choice necessarily, but knowing when enough is enough, and also knowing when some relationships are toxic. A big part of self-care that we underplay is the people in our lives. And it's hard to say, well, okay, I'm not going to associate with you anymore because it's not good for my self-care. But in all reality, that's what we have to do. There are toxic people in our lives sometimes that detracts from the amount of effort we're putting into becoming better, more balanced people. And I think that would be the biggest piece of advice for younger generations, is to know when to be able to recognize and know when to say enough is enough with a toxic relationship. I think that's a huge part of self-care that we underplay.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking about it, and I was like, you know, the generational difference here is my generation, the concept of self-care was something that kicked in when you were on the edge of a breakdown at some dimension in your life, right? Self-care was when bankruptcy was in the offing, or a divorce was ready to happen, or you've been, you know, years trying to reconcile with an abusive parent or sibling or friend or toxic individual in your life. You know, so our threshold for when you actually considered self-care was, you know, when you were in crisis. And Aaron, for yours, it sounds like, you know, you think of self-care when things get to be a source of some stress, or you at least look at them, and if they're sub-optimized, you have the ability to say, well, you know, I'm not worried about it or whatever. You know, it's not in crisis, but it's not where you'd like it to be. And Lily, I think your generation coming out of high school, you have the ability to understand the concept of self-care as a proactive thing, which definitely puts you much more in line with other cultures, like Aaron said, right? The idea of taking an afternoon nap. I mean, you are the champion of afternoon naps.
You're right.
I'm so jealous.
I take a lot of naps.
I had to. I'm sorry. I had to.
But I think that's kind of an interesting thing, though, is because I feel like my generation is kind of on that line of, you go to school, you do as you're told, you get your career, you be the American family fence picket.
Yeah, the expectation. Yeah,
the American white picket fence dream. Like I feel like my generation was on the tail end of that white picket fence dream, and then now in where we are today we're realizing that we don't want that, or at least some of us don't. And so we're starting to break away. Whereas Lily, your generation, I feel like it's more of, what white picket fence? I'm creating my own thing. And so I think that's also where you get the difference in workplace relationships, is because I think my generation is taking that and starting to run with it, but Lily's generation might be starting off from the starting block with running with that. And I think that probably changes up the reaction versus proactive version of self-care. Because you realize that what you want and what you want to create and foster in the world comes from you. Whereas my generation still feels a little bit like, well, we're just doing as we're told and doing what we're supposed to be doing. And so because of that, we have to care for ourselves in that environment. But if you're already creating what you want in the world, then it's much easier to say, well, I'm going to take a nap right now.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that analysis of generational differences?
Well, when you say white picket fence, I just think of like the American dream from like the 50s, where they're like, oh, take you and your 2 kids and your dog, your golden retriever, and drive over to the suburbs and live in this 1-story house. Like, I think like that's what I think of when you say white picket fence.
That's what I mean when I say white picket fence. Yep.
Okay, so yeah, like I definitely think like some people in my generation still want that, but that's because they came up with it on their own. Like, they've determined, like, I want a family, I want to do this, and I want to live in that like the suburbs with my family. But it wasn't because of people being like, oh, like, you should find a husband, find a wife, like, start a family. Like, it's not that. They just decided they want that for themselves. But a common conversation that comes up with me and my friends, this is weird because it's not going to happen anytime soon, but a conversation that happens sometimes, we'll be talking about, like, if we want kids, if we want husbands, wives, if we want to live in the city, like where we want to live, what we want to do, if we're just going to live by ourselves, like, and everyone has their own different plans for themselves. Like, my friends, some of them don't even know if they want to get married or have kids or be in a relationship ever. So I think that we're more, like you said, we're more proactive and we're more focused on ourselves and like what we want to do. I don't know if anyone else was focused on themselves in y'all's generations, but for mine, I think people are more not goal oriented, but I don't know how to like explain it. Like, we're not so focused on getting our lives together so early and like settling down. I think we want to like go out there and fail and see what happens and stuff like that. So
I think you hit it on the head with that last word you just used. Fail. Fail. So the concept of failing is much less threatening and much less, and it's a good thing. Trust me, it's a good thing.
mm-hmm.
The idea of failing and having it not be the end of the world is a huge difference for your generation. For my generation, failing was the end. Like, if you failed, that was it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was one path, there was one way, or there was 2 ways, and you picked, and you know, but you know, I've seen enough classmates die from drug overdoses and suicide and cancer and tragic accidents, and I've seen others have marriages fail and lose children and lose jobs, and I've seen others that have succeeded and had wonderful marriage. I mean, you know, the thing that's interesting about Facebook, we all talk about Facebook being the older generation, but I can see things happening to classmates of mine from afar that I never would have in the previous 30 years, right? So the idea that now it's like, okay, wait a minute, we all had this vision and we're all struggling, and we all thought, you know, your base assumption is everyone else's life is going along perfect. So-and-so had their shit together in high school, they went off to college, and in June, man, they went and they got that picket fence and they achieved it, and it all just, they've just, you know, coasted along, and I'm the only one that's struggling, and I'm the only one that, you know, I mean, you just get stuck in this place, and it's, you know, become apparent in the last 10 years. It's like, you know what, there's many people who have had a harder time than me. And there's some people that I've had a harder time than. And it gives you some perspective. And the idea of your generation, Lily, saying, I want to go out there, and if I fail, so be it, you know? And the idea that you don't have to have your life figured out at 19. And you don't even have to have your life figured out at 30 nowadays. I mean, because you're living, you know, to 70, and we're all working until we're 60. And, you know, by and large, the idea of retiring and just sitting around and gardening is a foreign concept to my generation and others. We're just not the way we're wired, right? And your generation as well. So I think self-care is also comes from allowing yourself to believe that if you're doing the best you can, that's all you can do, right? And I tell, when I talk to different people that I coach that are stressed or strained, I'm like, look, you're right where you're supposed to be. You're right where you're supposed to be. And if you're struggling right now, then that's what you're supposed to be doing right now, because it's going to help you grow. It's going to help you learn. If you're flying high, just ride it, enjoy it. You know, if you're confused and trying to figure things out, guess what? Given everything that you've gone through to this point, given where you are chronologically in your age and where you are in your stage of life, that you're supposed to be confused. You know, well, but so-and-so, they know exactly what they're going to do. Well, they're not you. They've had 17 years of life that's completely different from yours. So given where they're at, that's exactly where they're supposed to be. And the idea that you shouldn't compare is one I think that is starting to take root more and more. And I think that's a huge part of self-care, is just self, not the care part, just self.
Well, and I think that's kind of what I was going to say is I feel like there are more and more parents that are coming from that perspective of, if you're struggling right now, it's okay. That's what you're meant to be doing right now, and you'll come out of it, and being supportive in every step of the way versus criticizing them for not being better or figuring it out faster. And I think that's, I get the sense that parents generations ahead they had high expectations. They wanted the best for their kids. So they put that pressure on them to be the one that was being successful. And now I feel as though millennial parents particularly are really open to failure and allowing their kids to fall on their face and figure it out and be there to support them through it. And so I'm excited, and I'm hopeful that trend continues. Because even my mom, I mean, God love her, she's great. But, you know, I graduated from college, moved to Asia. I was using my degree, but then everything went wrong, and we all know that story. And if you don't, go watch the Boy Run episode. And I came back, and I considered myself kind of a failure because I didn't have a job. I was going to start working at a gym. I was planning on writing a book, but I was still working in a gym being a year out of college. And I felt like I was the ultimate failure because here I had this prestigious private university degree and I was working at Lifetime Fitness. But ultimately, the voice that kept coming back into my head and what she kept telling me was, why don't you find something to do with your degree? And even though I was writing a book, I mean, I was taking on a feat that most people my age don't. I was working on writing a first book, and she was still telling me, well, go find a job in digital media while you do that, you know, use your degree for something. And what I kept trying to explain to her was that I needed this job at the gym because it was an easy 9 to 5. I could leave work at home. I didn't have to think about it. It required no exterior creativity. Whereas if I got into a job with digital media production or videography or even graphic design, I know the way that my brain works, and I know myself well enough to know that in the off hours, I would continue to be thinking about work. And if I were doing that, then I wouldn't be thinking about my book. And so it became kind of a tension point for us because I was like, look, I know you want me to use my degree, but that doesn't mesh with what I'm doing in my life right now. And so I can empathize to an extent with, now granted, some of my friends had much more stricter parents that did not allow room for failure, did not allow room for changing careers, even if that's what their kid was meant to do. But I can empathize with this constant badgering of, I should be using my degree for this. I should be using my degree. I'm not doing what I'm meant to be doing. And I think that that trend is changing, and I hope that it is, because even though she meant well, it still left a mark on me that made me feel like a failure because I wasn't using my degree, even though I'm sure that's not what she meant, but that's how I took it. And so, you know, finally those suggestions stopped after my book was published, thank goodness, because I guess I proved it that I could do something else. But I think parents play a very significant role in that ability for the child to practice self-care proactively rather than reactively. There we go. Because there's that room for them to fail. And if there's not that room and there's not that love and acceptance around that, then it makes it really hard to feel like you're deserving of self-care and that that's something you should be worthy of.
Yeah, I think it comes with self-awareness, right? And I think the younger generations are becoming more self-aware sooner. You know, I mean, say what you will about all the social media, you'd get chewed up and spit out in each of your respective age groups if you didn't at some point realize you were going down a rabbit hole in that world and becoming a victim of it at some level, and then saying, hold on a second, wait a minute, I need to dial back. I need to gain some perspective. And it's that self-awareness of, okay, I know who I am, and I know what this visual thing says I am, and I know that I am not that Instagram profile. I am not that Twitter feed. Hopefully I'm authentic to an extent in both of those, but you know, just because you take a nice picture doesn't mean that you've got your life together. And just because you're sitting at a front desk of a gym staring off into space and checking people in doesn't mean you don't have your life together, right? And it goes to the power of what's going on inside of each of our heads. And I think, you know, the generational aspect of it. So my grandparents were the generation that got impacted with World War II and were children during the Great Depression, right? So they knew, I mean, our generation has no idea what a tough economy is. I mean, we've had a couple of recessions, but we've only ever had one Great Depression, right? So that influenced the next generation. And then my parents' generation was the first generation where they were blowing up pensions. They were laying people off. And for the first time in American history, after the Depression, people who thought they'd have a job for life didn't have a job for life. And people who had worked 10 years or 12 years and become a manager at their local manufacturing company were getting laid off. And now there was an influx of people into the market in the early 80s of people that you needed to come up with a way to differentiate. And one of the easiest ways to differentiate when you had a big job market was who had a degree. What was your formal education? Right, wrong, or indifferent, formal education became some, you know, so if you didn't finish high school and you were doing very well and you got laid off, you were the last person people were going to talk to. If you didn't go to college and get a degree and you got laid off, you're the second to last people that people were going to talk to, right? So everything that our parents and our grandparents, or my parents and grandparents, came to was hard earned. And I actually had a talk with a friend of mine from our town where we used to live that he called me just the other day, and we were talking about it. And we were talking about our kids growing up, and, you know, Matthew went to the coding boot camp, and Danny's in the Army, and April is living her life the way that she wants to live it, trying to figure out where she wants to go, but is as happy as I've seen her in a long time. And Becca is working as hard as anybody in this house at doing her coursework for her degree and looking to finish that and coming up with her internship. And Lily is just starting. I mean, every one of them is taking a different path. And, you know, his kids, one went to school, but then decided he wanted to become a firefighter. So now he's getting a degree, but it's in firefighting, and he, you know, the scientific side of it or whatever. Another one is going to look to become, I think he's joining the Army, and he wants to become a Green Beret, right? And we just said, you know, there's so many different paths, and it doesn't matter. You've got to follow your own path. And our generation was sold a bit of a bill of goods where the path is college. Pick a major, get a job, and do that. That's your only path to success. And if you don't get a degree, you're on the wrong path. And I looked, and there was a number of guys we used to mock. I feel terrible for this, but I'm going to be honest. We used to like look down upon the kids who went to the Votech and became the plumbers and became the carpenters. Now, granted, back in days when there was a lot more of them and there were older carpenters and older plumbers and it was hard to get started, you didn't get paid that much, but you made an honest living, and you could, if you were willing to put in the years, get a truck, become itinerant, or I don't know what the word is, a journeyman, become a journeyman electrician or something, and make a living. And guess what? You're making a living with no student debt. Meanwhile, I got a 4-year head start to school and came out with a pile of debt, not as big as some. And you kind of had that aha moment of like, oh my goodness, and all these people would start flipping houses and they realized, I really like the creative aspect of this and I don't like being in an office. So you get a lot of people leaving the office world to flip houses and get into real estate, right? I mean, it's so awesome that, Aaron, you're finding it out. You're finding it out after college, and some of your peers are and others aren't. But I mean, you're a little bit earlier ahead of the curve than my generation was. And Lily, you're looking at it as, I don't know, I don't think I'm going to go to college. I think I'm going to take a gap year. Or I think I'm going to just, but the idea of being open about it and having your parents open about it puts you in a place where you can you're already taking care of yourself, to kind of loop way all the way back around to self-care.
I think it's, excuse me, my voice decided to take a break. I think that's, if I were to coach someone on how to start self-care, I think that's where it would be. It's just self-awareness. Are you doing what you want to be doing? Are you pursuing the things that you want to be pursuing? And are you happy with where you are right now? And if not, what needs to change? Is it career? Is it lifestyle? What is it about that needs to change? And then taking loving steps towards that. I think the biggest part about self-care after self-awareness is loving yourself while you're achieving those next steps. And, if healthcare, or if, getting fit is one of the things that I want to do for self-care, it's loving myself on that journey and not saying, well, I didn't get buff in 24 hours, so I give up. It's self-care is caring for yourself while you're making those steps towards a healthier, happier life. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. I would say right now, if I were to pick the one thing about self-care that I am really good at, I think it is that self-awareness start, recognizing when something doesn't feel right. I think my intuition speaks volumes to me. And I do a fairly good job at listening to that and knowing when something doesn't feel right, or when an opportunity seems kind of weird, but it feels like I need to take it. And so I grasp onto it and I run with it, and it ends up being an entirely new learning opportunity and becomes a new passion. And so I think that part of self-care and being grounded in knowing what's authentic to me, I'm good at. I think the self-care that I need to work on would be knowing that I can't take everything on at one time, and knowing how to prioritize that, because my brain likes to do this thing where it just sparks every other idea at every millisecond, and I'm constantly thinking about what's next and what I could create, and that's great, but without some kind of channeling or limitation or boundary, it can become really stressful and chaotic and put a lot of unknown stress kind of into my subconscious. And so I think one of the aspects of self-care that I want to work on would be really harnessing that boundary and knowing, okay, this thing is not a priority right now, so let's write it down in a notebook and set it aside for later, and then maybe we can come back to it in a while. But I'm curious to know what you two both consider to be kind of your strength and your weakness in self-care, and kind of what you might want to work on. Might be a loaded question.
Okay. My strength, I wouldn't call it a strength, but something that I can recognize that I do to take steps towards self-care is like the same as you. Like I can recognize when something is not for me, and I can recognize when I need to stop pushing myself so hard, because I can notice whenever I can do those things and I'm pushing myself to do them, and when I'm just pushing myself just because I don't want to fail at it, even though I know I can. So I think I'm good at recognizing when to take a step back and relax and just take a deep breath. But even though I'm good at recognizing it, I think my weakness is I don't necessarily always take a step back. I think I'm like, okay, well, just because I might be pushing myself a little too hard doesn't mean I can't not do it. It just means I need to take a different approach to it. So I think I'm good at telling myself to take a step back, but I don't actually do it sometimes. And so I think that's where I don't fully follow through with the self-care part of it.
That awareness is really good though. That's a starting point.
Yeah, I just need to get better at the second part.
But it's, you know, recognizing too that you need it, but also recognizing that sometimes you're better at it than others. But then also what I really enjoyed about what you were just saying and how you said it was you weren't creating stress for yourself in the acknowledging of where you were failing to do it. You know what I mean? So some people, when they acknowledge that they're not doing something as fully as they could, you can sense in their voice that they're saying, well, maybe I'm just not able to do it, or I'm, you know, and you're acknowledging it, but yet saying somewhat level-headed around it. And you're like, okay, it's something I'm going to get better at. And at the end of the day, you're 17, right? So you're going to learn. And there's going to be days when you're 25 and when you're 45 where you're doing it well. And then there's other days when you're not. I mean, that's the other thing is just because you achieve a skill or some of these things need to be nurtured over time. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they get out of whack, right? But that doesn't mean though you have to, you know, I think of like the sails on a sailboat. You know, if you look at these larger sailboats and they have these different sails, and some of the smaller ones and bigger ones in different directions, and some steady the boat, some move the boat forward. And some of them, when they get out of whack, they're like flapping in the wind, right? And you know that something needs to be adjusted. But in that moment, maybe you're just like, yeah, I'll deal with that in a little bit. I know that's not really, but that's not hurting me right now. My journey, I'm making progress. I'm focused on this other thing. My concern is over here. And you can tune out that flapping sail. But at some point you then go over and you realize, okay, I do need to get it fixed, because I'm not a sailor, but if you've ever seen a flag that flaps in the wind all the time, eventually it becomes tattered, right? And so part of the reason you want to keep your sails trimmed on a boat is you don't want them getting tattered, because then they just start to rip and then they're no good. And so, you know, from an analogy perspective, just because it's out of whack in the moment doesn't mean you instantly, you know, it reminds me of a story with my dad. And I think I told it before, maybe it was on one of these episodes, but he worked at a restaurant and it was on the coast, and they had a screen door that would close in the summertime. And every once in a while it would get out of whack and the door would close. It was like a wooden door, and it would close and it wouldn't fit in the frame of the door. So it would kind of bang, and then it would just kind of sit there, and you could see the light and you knew that it didn't latch, right? And he had a position where he was a bartender, and he sat across from it. He could see the door, and he could know every time someone came in and it had banged, and he's like, oh, that thing needs to get adjusted. And at one point he went to his boss, and it would like, he just freak him out. And he's like, you know, he's like, hey, this has been out of whack for the last 4 days. I've ignored it, but I can't ignore it anymore. I can go home and I can get some stuff, and I think I can fix it so it'll close and you'll never have that problem again. And the bartender goes, yeah, well, you know what? It's just because a storm came in. Once this wet weather comes through, the wood won't be as wet, and it'll dry and it'll shrink back and it'll close fine. So just let the weather change and it'll be fine. You don't need. And so here my father was thinking of all these different ways he could make it break proof. And the owner was like, yeah, it'll adjust and it'll come back in line and it'll be true as soon as this you know, wet weather system goes through. And he was right. I mean, you know, the weather dried out and the thing closed again like it did before. So, you know, there's this notion of how hands-on do you need to be to fix everything? How hard do you need to hold the controls and what have you? But it starts with self-awareness. It starts with figuring out what your priorities are. And you talked, Aaron, you asked about me. I'm still trying to figure that out. I mean, for me, the self-care I have right now is my career and where I'm headed and what I want to do. And, you know, it's a struggle at this point because there's a way that I could do this that would be seemingly effortless, where I would just be able to step off and step into my new career if I do all the pre-work and I get everything lined up, and I can do it with almost no hiccup whatsoever. And then there's another part of me that's like, you know, maybe I take the step and it causes some short-term stress, but maybe that short-term stress and that change is exactly the catalyst I need, you know? So I'm actually in a period of my life where I'm trying to understand some of the self-care issues, because you can't go to a job every day if you don't really enjoy it and you don't see the longer purpose to it, right? But that's kind of where I'm at. And, you know, but I'll figure it out. But I'm probably not at a point where I'm doing much in the way of really good self-care right now.
Well, there's no better way to end an XYZ episode than with several brilliant rich analogies. So with that, we will sign off. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe, and share with your friends, because we're talking about cool stuff with cool people. I think I did the snaps last episode, and I'm really ashamed now. So, you know.
I love it.
Well, listen, I couldn't snap when I was younger, so this is like a highlight for me. So snap you later.